Thank you for downloading from the BBC. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
BBC.
And now on BBC World Service, the documentary, Europe's Choice, a new series in which Allan Little looks at some of the key moments and issues that lie behind the current crisis in the European Union. The story begins with a defining moment of the 20th century.
It was one of those hinges on which history turns.
The people of Berlin, East and West, have spent the night celebrating their new freedom to travel across...
The 9th of November 1989 changed the shape and the destiny of our continent.
Well, it's amazing. It's what we have waited for 23 years or something.
I am born here in the city, and I'm waiting to be free in the city.
But it was also a moment of hidden, unforeseen consequences.
The police commander on duty here at Checkpoint Charlie has suddenly announced that they can go over, even though they may not have the right documents, and they're simply charging now.
This programme for the BBC World Service looks at why the fall of the Berlin Wall put Europe on the road to a single currency, and ultimately to the current crisis. It's a story of how political ambition triumphed over economic reality, of how 17 nations married in haste and now repent at leisure. In 1989, many of Europe's leaders had lived through the Second World War. As young adults, they had helped build what would become the European Union. They had dreamed of a Europe with no internal borders and a single currency from the beginning in the 1940s. But no one foresaw in the euphoria of that November night that the fall of the Berlin Wall would give that dream new energy and a new urgency.
I watched the scenes on television last night and again this morning because I felt one ought not only to hear about them but see them, because you see the joy on people's faces and you see what freedom means to them. It makes you realise.
But Britain, always the half-hearted European, quickly grew uneasy. Its Prime Minister had also lived through the Second World War. Douglas, now Lord Hurd, was Mrs. Thatcher's Foreign Secretary.
It wasn't that she feared the jackboots would march all over Europe. She was sometimes portrayed as believing that. She didn't believe that, I'm sure of that. She did believe, though, that if you added X million highly disciplined Prussians and Saxons to the existing German mix, you'd get something absolutely formidable. And she was egged on in this by Nick Ridley. You remember he was Secretary of State for the Environment then.
And there were others who egged her on apart from Nicholas Ridley. Who were they, do you think?
I put a lot of blame on President Mitterrand. She had a respect for President Mitterrand. He was several bad things. He was socialist and he was French and so on and so on. But she forgave those because he was so clever and knew so much history. And he played on that. He said to me every now and then, Monsieur le Ministre, c'est 14 encore une fois. It's 1914 all over again. And therefore we and the Russians and you, the British, must stand up against it, as we did then. And this was music to her ears, really. And she kept on saying to me, oh, the French are on our side. But I knew that actually Mitterrand was discussing the whole question with Kohl on a completely different basis.
France had always seen the European community as a projection of French power and prestige on a continental scale. The old West Germany, with its sleepy capital at Bonn caressing the Belgian border, was containable within that idea of Europe. This new Germany would shift the European centre of gravity dramatically to the east. President Mitterrand was worried. But unlike Mrs. Thatcher, he thought opposing German unification futile. He offered his support, but at a price. The historian Timothy Garton-Ash.
The documents on this are by now absolutely clear. Most of the documents have been released. The price was an accelerated commitment to a timetable for European monetary union, a monetary union which Mitterrand saw as binding united Germany into Europe and preserving French leadership. The irony, of course, is that it's had precisely the opposite effect. It's not merely catalyzed, it's compelled the emergence of German leadership inside the Eurozone.
In Germany, too, the past is ever present. The spectre of hyperinflation haunts policy-making. Twice in the 20th century, Germans were ruined by it. Hyperinflation helped bring Adolf Hitler to power. The Deutschmark, introduced in 1948, was to the Germans so much more than a currency. It stood for a Germany reinvented after the nightmare of Nazism. Joachim Bitterlich was Foreign Affairs Advisor to Chancellor Kohl and a principal architect of the single currency.
This was the symbol of the renaissance of Germany after the war. Reform, that currency reform, with the introduction of a Deutschmark. And the whole debate how to structure Germany as a state came 1 year later. The Deutschmark became the symbol of Renaissance of Germany.
And so persuading the Germans to give it up was a very difficult thing.
Let's say it was nearly mission impossible. And therefore we had to offer something to the Germans, what I would call the translation of a German model at the European level, the euro, with the independent central bank, the obligation of fighting against inflation.
This was Germany's price for agreeing to give up the cherished Deutschmark. The new European Central Bank would have to be modelled on the mighty German Bundesbank. It would have to be independent of government. Its defining task would be to control inflation. The French didn't like this at all.
The French model was no independent European Central Bank, and the economic model accompanying it was not federal at all, but centralized. Let's call it dirigistic.
State interventionist.
State interventionist. And our model was social market economy.
How difficult were the French on the question of the independence of the European Central Bank?
Well, it was not in their nature. But they knew exactly the Germans will never do it without independence.
Even so, the drive to monetary union gathered speed. Just 2 years after the fall of the wall, the 12 member governments gathered in the Dutch city of Maastricht.
As the ministers stepped forward to sign the treaty, a string orchestra played classical music.
An enlarged Europe cannot be a centralized Europe with a single central power, a single central parliament. I think the logic is running against that.
The Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd, signed on behalf of the government. His signature also on a separate protocol, allowing Britain to decide later if it wants to take part in a single currency, due to be in place by 1999 at the latest.
Britain and Denmark negotiated an opt-out, but the other 10 signed up for eventual membership of the single currency. They laid down strict criteria. To qualify for membership, governments must achieve low inflation, low national debt, and low budget deficits. Germany insisted on fiscal and financial discipline. And at the last minute, Germany added another condition. The new European Central Bank would be forbidden from issuing Eurobonds to bail out any national government that was overspending. David, now Lord Williamson, was Secretary-General of the European Commission throughout the negotiations.
It wasn't in drafts that floated around for quite a long time. So in the original version, there would have been more possibility to take on at European level commitments such as ones which people are now arguing about.
So the way in which the treaty restricts the freedom of the European Central Bank was introduced to the treaty by the Germans.
As far as I recall, by the Germans.
Very late in the day.
Yep.
What do you think motivated that?
The same circumstances which have come to the head now. The German Constitutional Court had to protect their national position. They were signing up a treaty. They were giving away, as it always says in the German Constitutional Court's judgments, they were giving away the powers which belong to the German people, not to the German government, but to the German people.
The effect was to create a shared currency, but to rule out shared debt. The benefits of the single currency would be mutual, but there would be no mutualization of the risks that went with it. When the ink was dry on the Maastricht Treaty, the criteria were clear. To get into the euro, each nation would have to prove that its public finances were very sound indeed. John, now Lord Kerr, was UK ambassador to the EU at the time of the Maastricht Treaty.
If you think back to 20 years to the Maastricht negotiation, when we were working all this out, my view was that it would be 5, possibly 6 countries that would start. It never occurred to me that Italy or Spain, let alone Greece, would qualify.
European countries now settled to the task of getting their public finances ready. They did this in part through something called the exchange rate mechanism, a kind of monetary straitjacket that had been set up in the 1970s to try to limit fluctuations in the value of Europe's national currencies. Britain had joined the ERM in 1990. Sir Nigel Wicks served both at the British Treasury and on the European Monetary Committee, the body that created the single currency.
One of the objectives was actually how to deal with inflation. The Treasury was looking for a sort of holy grail. How can we control inflation?
The Germans had mastered inflation. They wanted exchange rate stability for a different reason, to protect their lucrative export markets. Separate currencies and fluctuating exchange rates meant interrupted sales. A sudden drop in the value of, say, the Italian lira made German exports suddenly unaffordable in Italy. The Germans came to see in separate currencies a means of protectionism, a way for national governments to erect artificial trade barriers. Dietrich von Kiel was German ambassador to the EU for much of the 1990s.
We wanted Italy to stop devaluating the lira. That had to do with such limited, but nevertheless, in the German political field, important things like Bavaria needing to continue to sell their surplus milk to Italy, or Volkswagen wishing to keep the Fiat competition within certain limits. It's a political game always also. It's not only one of principles, not even in Germany.
In 1992, at the time of the Maastricht Treaty, 11 countries had joined the exchange rate mechanism, 10 of which were, in effect, pegging their currencies to the ever-dependable, ever-predictable Deutschmark. But Germany was paying a high price for reunification, and Deutschmark interest rates were high. Some of Europe's weaker currencies were now woefully overvalued. By September, it was clear that Italy was struggling. Sir Nigel Wicks sensed a tipping point. His boss, the minister charged with maintaining UK financial stability, Norman Lamont, was that evening at London's Royal Albert Hall, a guest of the BBC at the Proms.
I got a message at home from an Italian colleague that they were liable to fall out. And this was the days before text messaging and things like mobile phones. And I had to get a message to Norman Lamont, who was in the box, the VIP box. And so I sort of passed him sort of cryptic messages. Look, I'm awfully afraid my Italian friend is very ill, and I'm not going to sure that he's going to survive the weekend. Perhaps we ought to have a word about funeral events and things like that.
So you had to speak to him in code?
Yes.
Why?
Because I couldn't actually say to the BBC people, can you tell Norman Lamont that the Italians are just about to fall out the ERM and we better think of a contingency plan? Maybe your music department would not have actually passed it on to the news department. I couldn't say that, so I had to talk in code.
Then, as now, the contagion spread. The markets turned on the pound. The value of sterling started tumbling. To stay in the ERM, the British government tried to defend the currency.
Tonight, a massive 5% hike in Britain's interest rates to shore up the ailing pound. It didn't work. Hopes of recovery smashed with warnings that mortgages could go through the roof and thousands...
Norman Lamont raised interest rates by 2% in the morning and then by a further 3% in the afternoon. To the markets, it looked like panic. It also looked hopeless. By the end of the day, he'd put them back down to where they'd started. The pound had lost 17% of its value.
The government has concluded that Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism.
The effort needed to keep the pound pegged to the mighty Deutschmark was too much for the British economy to bear. It came to be known as Black Wednesday. It was an early lesson in the limits and dangers of a one-size-fits-all currency union. Despite these clear warning signs about the dangers of binding so many national currencies into one signal, nonetheless, the steam train to monetary union
still steamed ahead.
Sir Nigel Wicks, Britain's man on the European Monetary Committee, was still busy in Brussels building the single currency. Shouldn't Black Wednesday have been a warning that national economies needed their currencies to be flexible in value?
But you see, what the mainland Europeans argued at the time was they argued the reverse. They said because it was so difficult to run an ERM, which you had independent currencies, and those independent currencies were effectively dominated by what decisions the Bundesbank took, the answer was to have one currency where you had interest rate decisions for the single currency area taken by the ECB, the European Central Bank, where everyone was round the table.
And so the steamship single currency sailed blissfully on. Maastricht had set notional deadlines for Europe's national currencies to lock themselves together. 1997 if possible, 1999 at the latest. In 1995, 3 years after Maastricht, a young civil servant at the French finance ministry called Jacques Lafitte got a phone call asking if he'd like to relocate to Brussels to work on the Euro project.
What kick-started the process after this long period of inertia?
Frankly, that's simply my commissioner realizing that we were not ready. We were not ready to introduce the single currency. We were not even ready to produce a paper who would explain how we would do that.
And who was driving it politically?
Well, in a way, the treaty. Quite simply, I mean, the treaty had been ratified with the opt-outs that we all know, but we had to implement the treaty. The Commission would have been guilty of not doing its job if we had not proposed the appropriate transition scenario and the secondary legislation that had to come with it. At the time, between ourselves, we thought, oh gosh, 2 years to go. I mean, we have no design for the coins and notes. Even for the simplest things, we had a problem.
Coinage was the least of their concerns. The key question was who would qualify for membership in the first wave. Which countries would fulfil the strict Maastricht criteria? Which economies would really be ready?
Europe at the time was essentially divided between the countries who would potentially fulfill the criteria, but were not so keen on moving to a European currency, and the ones who potentially would not fulfill the criteria, who were far more positive about giving up their national currency.
12 of the European Union's 15 member governments wanted in. Britain, Denmark and Sweden stood back. Sir Nigel Wicks.
The other member states didn't want to be regarded as second-class citizens, and you found that there was an internal political dynamic which made them want to be really close members of Europe. The Spaniards and the Portuguese had not long come out of dictatorship, so they wanted to be part of it. Similarly with the Greeks. And if being part of the club was being member of the monetary union, they would be members of the monetary union.
Very political dynamic, not much economics going on.
Not much economics to that.
Many in Northern Europe wanted the euro phased in gradually, to start with perhaps 5 or 6 members whose economies were truly ready, and to grow from there. The Dutch were not happy. Their former finance minister, Wim Duisenberg, was an early doubter.
Mr. Duisenberg, who eventually became the first president of the European Central Bank, went on the record in January 1995 saying that Europe was not ready and it would take at least one more generation before we can possibly introduce a single currency.
So there were doubts from some very, very serious people about whether Europe was ready for this venture. Why were those doubts in the end overcome? Why did the pro-euro, the pro-single currency camp prevail?
Well, first there were a lot of people in the pro-euro camp, make no mistake. But it's clear that Chancellor Kohl played a decisive role.
And why did he want it?
The Chancellor Kohl, that we knew, in 1995 wanted the euro for at least one very good reason, which is that the same Chancellor Kohl already wanted the euro back in 88-89.
You have to look back at the whole history of European integration, which had happened through the so-called Monnet method or functionalist method, which is that you go almost by stealth through economic integration to political integration.
Timothy Garton-Ash.
Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand thought that, of course, a closer fiscal union and political union would follow monetary union, and they wanted that to happen. They thought it would necessarily follow, but it didn't.
Jacques Lafitte told the BBC World Service that it was an open secret among the technocrats putting the single currency together that Europe's southern tier was not ready. But Europe's political leaders, not the supposedly unaccountable bureaucrats of the Commission, but the democratically elected national governments themselves, did not want to listen.
Italy, Spain, Portugal and Greece, but they were in different situations. Spain was a very impressive country in terms of public finances, for instance. Of course, we had our doubts that they were completely ready when we looked, for instance, at their balance of payments. Competitiveness was not one of the criteria. So the only thing we could do in practice, in the convergence reports or the economic assessments that we did twice a year, was to say to Spain, well, maybe you want to do something about your labour market and your competitiveness and your unit labour costs. Italy was a country that a lot of us thought, but we couldn't tell people, was not really ready, but they were desperate on joining from day one, absolutely desperate.
So it was your view that Italy was not ready. Was that view widely shared?
Behind closed doors, yes.
Why did nobody tell the truth?
Because we have had in Europe, and not just with the euro, a big political correctness problem over the decades. This good old tradition of not pointing the finger at any other member state just to make sure that the other member state would not point the finger at you someday. It would have been difficult unless they would have remained very far away from the criteria.
But they were far away from the criteria.
Well, no. They had a special tax, did some massaging of the figures, but not much, and they were not the only ones.
How many countries did you think in your mind would be ready by the end of the decade?
The vision that was shared by most EU officials, but again, we had to shut our big mouth, and we're just smallish technocrats at the end of the day, was Germany, Benelux, Austria, France, plus the countries to the west and to the north, so potentially Finland and Ireland.
So 6 or 7?
Or 6 to 8, something like that.
In 1999, 11 countries locked their currencies together, Greece making it 12 2 years later. This was almost twice the number many believed suitable. But political imperatives drove the whole process, and at key moments they trumped economic better judgment. The Europeans, in their post-1989 euphoria, allowed hope to silence legitimate doubt. Next week on the BBC World Service, I'll examine how that pattern would continue, with even the Germans casually and disastrously disregarding what were meant to be strict, legally binding fiscal rules, as the juggernaut of monetary union rolled on, with even the Greeks on board.
We always saw the head of the statistical agency of Greece that compiled all these statistics on the deficits, inflation, etc. We used to call him the magician because he made inflation disappear, and then he also made the deficits disappear.
Europe's Choice was presented by Allan Little and produced by Jane Beresford.
There are dozens of different podcasts now available from the BBC, including news, documentaries, science, business, arts and sport. For details of them all, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts. Thank you for downloading from the BBC. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
And now on BBC World Service, the second part of Europe's Choice. Allan Little looks at some of the key moments and issues that lie behind the current crisis in the European Union. This week's programme begins in the messy wake of Britain's general election in 2010.
The news headlines this morning: Britain is heading for a hung parliament. That appears to be...
I want to make a big, open and comprehensive offer to the Liberal Democrats.
I think it would be best if everybody were just to take a little time so that people get the good...
Saturday the 8th of May 2010. Alistair Darling was surprised to find that he was still the minister in charge of UK finances. The political party he belonged to had lost the general election, but no party had a majority, so no new government was yet in office. He found himself unexpectedly back at 11 Downing Street, his former official London residence.
I left fully confident that I would not darken the doors of the place again, because, I was pretty clear that we weren't going to win the election, frankly. And of course, having vacated the flat, there's practicalities like there's no sheets, no blankets, no toothbrush, nothing.
Next day, Sunday the 9th, he had to head to Brussels. Europe was in turmoil.
European Union finance ministers have been discussing measures to prevent the Greek debt crisis from spreading to other countries.
The idea that this meeting would wrap up in the late afternoon was always optimistic.
He didn't want to commit the incoming government to anything, so he'd already informed the European Commission that Britain would not contribute to the bailout fund that was now desperately needed. What happened next would demonstrate a key weakness of the EU as an institution, its inability to take decisive action in a moment of urgency.
This is yet another one of these meetings where, instead of sitting down at the appointed time and saying, right, what is the issue here? The issue is we've got to put together a rescue fund, because if we don't do that, the European Central Bank will not agree to buying bonds of distressed countries. And there were one or two other smaller points, but that was the big thing. So what happens? The meeting doesn't start for, I think it was like a couple of hours late. The European Commission put forward proposals that we had to contribute to it, despite me having told the Commissioner there was no way we were going to do that. This went on for hour after hour after hour.
The urgency was clear. They all understood. It was a Sunday evening, and the Asian markets would open within hours. The politicians present knew and would later admit that there was a real danger that the euro would fall apart that very night.
I'd had a number of conversations with Tim Geithner, the US Treasury Secretary, who was increasingly concerned, if not frightened, at Europe's inability and unwillingness to deal with what he saw as a growing catastrophe in Greece. And I remember being party to one of these big phone calls with, half a dozen finance ministers, when again and again he kept saying, what are you guys going to do about it?
For this programme on the BBC World Service, I'm going to look at the paradox this crisis highlighted. It's one that goes to the heart of political Europe, and one that will now have to change. The EU is often characterised as undemocratic and unaccountable, as having usurped the sovereign rights of the nations. But if you thought that the EU was undemocratic and over-centralised before this crisis, get ready to be further outraged by what lies ahead. On that night in 2010, as so often in the past, the EU found itself paralysed, not by the centralisation of power in Brussels, but by the dispersal of real power among 27 sovereign nation-states that couldn't agree.
There have been attempts, for example, to have some sort of leadership in Europe. We made an attempt to have a troika, to have Britain join France and Germany in making some of the decisions in Europe. Our attempt to do that was a bit of a failure.
Jonathan Powell was Chief of Staff to former British Prime Minister Tony Blair.
We had one meeting after 9/11 with Chirac and Schroeder that went fine, and then we tried to have a follow-up meeting in Downing Street. But as soon as it became public, we had telephone calls from everyone else demanding to come. So first Mr. Berlusconi called and said he had to come. He absolutely insisted on it, so we allowed him to come. Then we had Mr. Aznar of Spain who called and said, if you're having the Italians, you've certainly got to have me in. I have to come. Then we had the President of the Commission call and said that he had to come, and he had to bring with him the Belgian Prime Minister, Guy Verhofstadt, because he was President of the EU. And then finally, just as we were sitting down to dinner, Wim Kok called me on my mobile and said he was coming as well because the Netherlands needed to be represented. And I had to tell him we'd run out of food and he had to have the vegetarian option.
Everyone wants to be at the top table. It's a matter of prestige. A public finance crisis in Greece shouldn't matter very much. Greece accounts for only 2% of Europe's economy. But in a Europe of the single, borderless currency, contagion spreads. So it matters very much. In the mid-1990s, the economist Miranda Zaffa had left her native Greece to join Salomon Brothers in London. She was watching and writing reports for the investment firm as Greece made its preparations to join the euro. Member states had to prove that they had low national debt, 60% of GDP at most, low annual budget deficits, 3% of GDP at most, and low inflation. Greece cooked the books.
For example, there was a rule set by Eurostat, the statistical agency of the Commission, saying that transfers to public enterprises are not counted as expenditure if they are matched by equal equity participations. So let's say the Greek railroads that lose about $1 billion a year has more employees than passengers. The former minister Stefanos Manos had said publicly at the time that it's cheaper to send people by taxi. How did they cover this deficit? Well, it was as if the company would issue more shares that the government would buy, and then that was not counted as expenditure. It was a financial transaction.
Let's pause for a moment to take that in. The Greek railways were losing $1 billion a year. The state was paying. But the government declared that it was using this money to buy equity in the railway company. So that huge €1 billion loss did not appear as an item of expenditure in the nation's budget. It was hidden, deliberately, pushed into the distant future as debt.
What you've got in front of you here is a paper you wrote, that you prepared.
Yes. So this report is dated December 15, 1998, and it explained these various tricks. So all that was out in the markets. It was not a surprise that a decade later we are where we are.
So you knew, because you wrote it in this paper, that Greece wasn't.
And all the clients of Salomon Brothers knew. So I used to come to Athens from London with clients of Salomon Brothers, and we always saw the head of the statistical agency of Greece that compiled all these statistics on the debt, the deficits, inflation, etc. We used to call him the magician because he made inflation disappear, and then he also made the deficits disappear.
By 2004, Greece was already a member of the Eurozone, but the artifice was now beginning to show. The conjuring tricks were becoming transparent. That year, Peter Doukas took over as budget minister. He wanted to look in detail at the nation's balance sheet.
I invited the senior staff of the ministry and asked them to give me all the details of the budget that had been voted in the previous December, 2.5 months before I took over. And I said, don't worry about persecution or anything, just tell me what the true story is and we can work out, that's fine.
What was the difference between the budget that had been prepared and the real balance sheet?
It was virtually about a 7% of GDP difference, because the budget said there's going to be a 1.5% deficit. And the actual deficit, based on that budget, was 8.3% difference.
How did that happen?
That's a very good question, and I guess governments tend to want to show a more optimistic light. They don't want to discourage people by painting a blue picture that people may actually walk away from things, or investors would walk away, and you want to preserve a climate of optimism.
And so, what were your feelings when you found out the truth?
Well, I said that it's an alarming situation and we should start chopping down the budget. But the answer at the time was, listen, we're having Olympic Games in a few months and we cannot upset the whole population and start having strikes and everything just before the Olympic Games.
So instead of reforming the public finances, Greece borrowed and borrowed and committed to debts that generations not yet born would have to pay off.
I said, let's borrow for 20, 30, and 50 years. And those times were easy years. And pretty much bankers would line up and beg us virtually to borrow from them rather than from another bank.
What's more, Greece could borrow cheaply at very low interest rates. Investors assumed their money was safe because Greece was in the euro. It got credit on the same conditions, give or take, as Germany. The so-called spreads, the differences in the rates at which sound and unsound economies could borrow, seemed to have disappeared. Suddenly, in this one very narrow respect, every country was Germany. Dietrich von Kio was German ambassador to the EU in the 1990s.
We didn't understand or didn't foresee that due to this wonderfully successful appearing monetary union, everybody would get similar conditions as Germany would. Now we have these enormous spreads again, as they were before monetary union. But for too long, they didn't really come to play.
The markets just did not believe there was a risk of default. They failed to see the debt mountains that were accumulating. Eurozone members were obliged by treaty to keep their budget deficits below 3% of GDP. Member states had signed up to something called the Stability and Growth Pact that allowed the EU to punish governments that breached this limit by fining them. How serious was the EU about enforcing this commitment?
You had a treaty obligation to get your debt down to 60% of GDP, didn't you?
Right.
What was your view of that treaty obligation, given that you were riding at well over 100% of GDP?
Well, as I said, I was in the minority that said, let's squeeze things and push things. People didn't feel there was going to be any consequence. You know, if you can borrow, and this was a prevailing attitude. Again, I was a very, very small minority, not in Greece, in Europe, because Europe didn't see that problem coming.
Was there any pressure coming from Europe? From the Commission, from those charged with regulating the Treaty of Maastricht, seeing that it was enforced?
Yeah, there was pressure, but not the sort of thing that is breathing down your neck. Everybody who could read the numbers could see that the numbers are off, even if you allow for constructive accounting or whatever.
Four months before Peter Dukas took office in 2004, the Stability and Growth Pact was as good as dead. Both France and Germany had shattered the rule that limited budget deficits to 3% of GDP. Germany, the great European financial disciplinarian, the nation for whom inflation was a living trauma, the nation that above all others could be trusted to live within its means, was struggling. The cost of reunification after the fall of the wall in 1989 had left a big hole in its budget. Now Germany and France had broken the very rules they had insisted on for everyone else. The former German ambassador to the EU, Dietrich von Kio.
They really sinned by doing something not very serious, which was one of the consequences of German unification and the enormous expenditures there. They flexibilized the schedules primarily. It was not a real sin. But when a big country does that, how can you afterwards impose on smaller countries, including Greece, to obey by the rules?
The view was that, if the big boys won't adhere and impose discipline on themselves, they're going to be more relaxed in terms of the treaty.
The former Greek budget minister Peter Dukas speaking to the BBC World Service.
I mean, nobody can impose sanctions on Germany, which is a superpower by European standards, and similarly to France. So they don't adhere. The pressure was simply not there.
France and Germany should have been fined by the EU. The safekeeping of the single currency required it. It was the European Commission's job to do that as a way of enforcing the Stability and Growth Pact. But as always, the unelected European Commission ran up against something much more powerful in the EU, the democratically elected national governments, on this occasion in the shape of ECOFIN, the Council of Finance Ministers.
The crucial event for the development of the Stability and Growth Pact happened very shortly after I'd arrived. In November 2003, during the Italian presidency, at an ECOFIN meeting in Brussels, in a small room with a round table, as I recall, because in those days that was before enlargement, and there were still only 15 of us in the room.
Sir John Grant, who was at the time Britain's ambassador to the EU.
In other words, to make public the failure of France and Germany to correct its excessive deficit was not accepted by the Council. There wasn't a qualified majority. There weren't enough countries in the Council who voted in favour of what the Commission wanted to do.
So basically, a majority of the finance ministers sitting around that table voted to let France and Germany off.
That's what the Council decided, yeah.
How did Britain vote on that day?
Britain voted with the French and German position.
Gordon Brown.
Can't remember whether the Chancellor was in the room at the time, but that was the United Kingdom's position.
France and Germany on that occasion had disregarded their obligations under the Maastricht Treaty, breached their obligations under the Maastricht Treaty, and Britain voted to let them do it without sanction.
Well, they're your words, not mine, but the record shows that we didn't vote in favour of the Commission proposal.
Does that mean that the Stability and Growth Pact, which was intended as a mechanism to make sure that countries who were sharing a currency didn't damage each other's currencies and economies by overspending, failed as a mechanism, as a system?
It didn't fail as a mechanism at that point, in the sense that, I think you'd find many economists who would argue that the problem wasn't the 3% deficit or the trajectory of reduction only. There were a whole bunch of other things that lie behind the difficulties that the euro faces at the moment. But the credibility of the Commission and the readiness of the member states to accept the authority of the Commission as the politically independent enforcer of the Maastricht criteria was obviously gravely undermined.
In the optimistic mood of 2003, with economies growing and Europe on the verge of a dramatic eastern expansion, this didn't much matter. But later, when crisis hit, the old divide would open up again. The elected bodies like the Council of Ministers versus the unelected like the Commission. To rescue the Stability Pact, the Commission would have needed to be far stronger, but that would have led to cries of outrage about the democratic legitimacy of faceless EU bureaucrats issuing diktats. Sir Stephen Wall is a former chief advisor on Europe to the British government.
One of the paradoxes, really, in a way, or contradictions within the single currency, is that institutionally, in European terms, it's rather weak. I mean, the European Commission, which ought to be the authority with the power of enforcement, is deliberately given very little power. For what was, in a way, the sort of climax of the what was supposed to be the sort of the traditional community method, it was very intergovernmental, with all the weaknesses that implies, that basically, if you can't get agreement among everybody, you're stuck.
Again, the paralysis that so frustrated Alistair Darling in his last weekend as Chancellor. The institutional answer is clear. Give the Commission the power to cut through the inertia caused by national disagreements and allow it to force member states to obey the rules they've agreed to. The problem with that is profound and so far unanswered. It's not very democratic. Should there be a more powerful but democratically elected Commission? John, now Lord Kerr, is a former British ambassador to the EU.
I think it should not be democratised. It's very important that the Commission should be the unpopular policeman of the rules, the person who takes you to court, the person who insists that what is written down in legislation in the single market is actually applied by the member states. Nobody likes the policeman, but the last thing you want is a Commission where people regard themselves as their country's representatives inside the Commission. It should be run by a very powerful figure, and its job should be to look after the common interest, not the interest of any particular country.
I am one of the small fathers of the Stability Pact, so I'm not going to throw the baby out through the window, but we had our doubts that an ex post punitive system would be completely workable and sufficient to hold the monetary union together in the long run.
Jacques Lafitte was at the time a French Treasury official seconded to Brussels to help build the single currency. He says the pact emerged as a compromise. The punishment it allowed for governments that crashed through the deficit limits was, as he says, ex post punitive. In other words, the Commission could only fine them after they'd broken the rules. This was flawed in several ways. First, the sanction came too late to prevent the overspend, and the subsequent fine would make the overspend even worse. That's another reason why, when the crunch came, those finance ministers at the ECOFIN meeting voted to let Germany and France off. Lafitte and others wanted the Commission to have the preemptive power to prevent member countries overspending in the first place, what he calls an ex-ante punishment system.
We did make a number of other suggestions to the member states at the time that were rejected because they would have resulted in transferring sovereignty from national capitals to Brussels or maybe Frankfurt.
What kind of systems did you propose?
All sorts of things. One of the issues that was about the external representation of the euro. Who would be Mr. Euro in front of, say, the US authorities? On the banking side was clear, would be the president of the ECB. On the political side was far less clear. Member states essentially said, we don't need anything like this. Commission, go away.
Because it involved a transfer of sovereignty from member states to the centre?
Yes, that has always been the issue.
The Stability Pact at the time was the best enforcement mechanism you could get?
Yes. Deep inside, I was convinced it would not be enough. Although I wrote certain bits and pieces of the Stability Pact myself, I was dead sure that we need an ex-ante convergence system.
So member states retained the power to police themselves, and, as we now know, this in some cases included the power to cook their books and disguise their real expenditure and publish hopelessly unrealistic accounts of their economic performance year after year. There was no EU institution with the power to enforce it. Until now, that is. For the Eurozone is now moving in this direction. Soon, national governments will have to submit their annual budgets in advance for approval in Brussels, before they put them to their national parliaments. And the shape of what is to come can be seen clearly on the Berlaymont building, which houses the European Commission in the heart of Brussels. Draped down the side of it across many stories is an enormous blue banner whose slogan captures the direction in which Europe is now moving. The slogan says, "Towards a stronger European economic governance." This crisis has made even more fraught a very old tension in Europe. How long will it be before national populations start to say, wait a minute, is the government that we elected accountable downwards to we the people, or is it accountable upwards to a bunch of people whose names we don't even know, who work in the European Commission? Next week in Europe's Choice on the BBC World Service, can the centre hold if national populations revolt in the name of democracy?
Of course the European Union won't last forever. It emerged from a particular historical constellation after 1945. Ironically, the next great moment in European history, 1989, was a moment of unification but also sowed the seeds of disunification. I would say, be careful what you wish for.
Europe's Choice was presented by Allan Little and produced by Jane Beresford.
There are dozens of different podcasts now available from the BBC, including news, documentaries, science, business, arts and sport. For details of them all, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts. Thank you for downloading from the BBC. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Now on BBC World Service, the final part of Europe's Choice. Allan Little looks how the current crisis might affect the future of the European Union.
This is what the Greek government faces in their attempts to impose austerity on the Greek people. Another day of action, another general strike by public sector workers has brought the country to a standstill. Already several thousand demonstrators have gathered here near the National Museum for a march down to Constitution Square and the country's parliament. But this is not just a revolt by Greeks against their own government. It's also a revolt by Greece itself against Europe. Because the demonstrators here have the added argument that the Prime Minister they blame for imposing austerity was not chosen by Greeks themselves, but was chosen by other European powers, and principally Germany.
Germany is the one that's the locomotive of paying for other people's problems. They will probably ask to have a much bigger say in what's happening in Greece and Italy and Spain.
Peter Doukas is a former Greek budget minister. The EU was conceived, in part at least, as a way of addressing the problem of Germany's mighty weight in Europe. Integration was, its leaders thought, a way to normalise, to Europeanise Germany. For this BBC World Service programme, I'm going to ask, is this crisis in the Eurozone having the opposite effect of Germanising much of Europe?
Decisions will be made by those who actually pay for the biggest part of the bill. So the center of gravity of Europe is rapidly moving towards Berlin.
So do you think there's a kind of Germanization of Europe taking place?
Well, first of all, we had a customs union that benefited Germany because it could export its competitive products freely. And then you had the monetary union, and now you have a fiscal union. And in the fiscal union, they will be the ones dictating the terms with France as a junior partner.
Germany is in a position today where it is, like it or not, and the truth is it doesn't like it, in the driving seat of the European Union. Germany's never wanted to be in the driving seat. My memories of Germany in Brussels over 20 years or more is a country that was always utterly incompetent in punching its weight.
For no one is more spooked by the idea of German supremacy in Europe, by the historical resonance of that, than the Germans themselves. Quentin Peel of the Financial Times in Berlin is a veteran Europe watcher.
You have a devolution of power and a coalition system of government, which by definition means weak government. And Germans like weak government. It's not what they had in the 1930s, anything not to be back in the 30s. And I remember going to see the German ambassador in Brussels back in the 1980s. And I said, Ambassador, I really want to understand what your position is on reforming the common agricultural policy. And he said, Herr Peel, I would like to understand that too.
The European leaders who built the EU were driven by their experience of the most destructive war in human history. They wanted to answer Europe's German question. How do we stop it happening a third time? They succeeded. But there is a new, younger Germany now. This Germany resents the assumption that it'll be Europe's paymaster, endlessly picking up bills run up by feckless and ill-disciplined neighbours. The historian Timothy Garton-Ash.
The problem is that the consensus which was there 20 years ago or even 10 years ago for making this work by moving forward to closer union is no longer there in Germany, because Germany has become a more normal country like France or Britain.
We see clearly in polling now today that many Germans are either disappointed from Europe or confused or both.
Ulrike Gouraud of the European Council on Foreign Relations based in Berlin.
You have a new generation of the, let's call it the 30-something people who are now going into the ministries, going into the media, and they have just a different narrative. You have basically still a very pro-European Germany, but a Germany that puts a price tag behind Europe. I'm still from a generation without price tag, which is Europe at any price, any condition, good for us, glue of history. This is gone.
Almost everywhere, the crisis has provoked greater suspicion of the idea of Europe, a retreat to the nations, and not just in Greece and Germany. If I'd been making this programme even 5 years ago, I'd have gone to Turkey to consider where Europe ends geographically. Turkey first applied for membership 40 years ago. But does our common European home really stretch to the borders of Iran and Iraq, to the Euphrates Valley and the fringes of Babylon? The question seems dated now. Turkey is moving on. Sinan Ulgan is a former member of the Turkish delegation to the EU.
At the time, opinion polls were showing a support of almost 75%. Since 2004, what we have seen is a gradual but clear decline in domestic support for EU membership. Today we have, according to the opinion polls, we have about between 35 and 40% support for EU membership. So there has been a slide of almost 35 basis points.
The economic benefits of membership for Turkey are now in doubt. Over the last 10 years, Turkey's economy has grown by an average of 5% a year. Per capita income has tripled. It's now the world's 16th largest economy. In the Arab Spring, Turkey is seen as a political model to emulate, a successful fusion of Muslim and democratic sensibilities. Turkey is turning its back on a European future and forging links with a world familiar to previous generations of Turks, the Ottomans. Turkey is drawing closer to its old imperial territories.
Turkish policymakers don't like to use the term of neo-Ottomanism because it has imperial connotations. However, when you look at what's happening in practice, it is difficult to argue against that. When you look at where Turkey wants to grow its influence, it happens to coincide with the Ottoman geography. But obviously another explanation is that really Turkey was able to take advantage of two trends in this geography. One is rising anti-Americanism after the war in Iraq, And two is really the lack of a true Arab leadership. And possibly a third one is still the continuing ineffectiveness of the EU as a foreign policy actor.
And so the shape of future Europe is shifting. In the beginning, Germany and France married their fortunes together. The European project was designed to protect German industry and French agriculture, and it served that purpose well. But that was when Germany was West Germany, with its little provincial capital at Bonn, close to the Belgian border. That Germany was easy for France to embrace.
Yeah, this is the craft shop for the mattresses, the high-temperature mattresses.
In a suburb of Berlin, the capital of a reunited Germany, Carolyn Beck is the director of a family company founded by her great-grandfather in 1874. Today, they make heat insulation equipment for power plants, amongst other things. She's one of Germany's prodigious, prolific exporters.
I would say more than 70% of my business is foreign business now.
You don't just mean not German, you mean
not German,
not European?
Not European. South America, Asia, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, all the Stan countries.
Germany is the world's second largest exporter. Exports account for a third of the country's output, and most of its exports are sold inside the EU, so Germany is probably the biggest single beneficiary of the single market and currency. But Berlin is emphatically not West Germany. It is Prussia. It faces east, beyond Europe's borders. The Germany that France married in 1957 didn't include this, wasn't nearly so eastern.
Ukraine and Russia because it's near. It's near to our mentality. Yeah, as a Berlin company, there was always a Moscow-Berlin relationship. 2/3 of my stuff comes from Eastern German. We are very close to the East here in Berlin. I'm sure that my grandparents came from, I don't know, Poland or Russia or somewhere around the area. I don't know, but I think so.
How important will Europe be in the future to your business plans?
Not important at all, sorry to say.
In the ashes of its lost war, Germany emerged to build Europe's strongest economy. It did it on the solid rocks of fiscal discipline and a sound currency. The Germans are not alone in believing that they are being punished for their own success and prudence. Finland suffered a devastating recession in the early 1990s. They did not riot, they did not strike, they did not take bailouts from Brussels. They took their self-prescribed austerity medicine and turned their fortunes around.
We are trying to go into the government. We will negotiate with the other parties who are coming into coalition what should be the future of the European Union.
In their recent general election, a nationalist party called the True Finns took 20% of the seats in Parliament. Their message was this: why should our currency be put at risk by the behaviour of nations who did not share our pain, who chose the easy spendthrift path? Sampo Terho is a True Finn member of the European Parliament. Speaking to the BBC World Service, he says Finland made the mistake of joining the euro in a short-lived fit of naive optimism after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Finland, until then constrained by its Russian neighbour, was free at last to join the Western European mainstream.
Finland was in a sort of euphoric state.
Euphoric?
Yeah, that's right. It was sort of a great relief to finally go to the West and join everything we could. And for years and years, we were the yes men of EU, the nice guys who always wanted just to be in the core, no matter what the cost. Now, for the first time after the elections, we have started to use the word no in the EU circles, and that has caused some eyebrows to lift.
And what are you saying no to?
We are saying no to the federalism. We are saying no to giving up our independence, our sovereignty, to this, monster of a bureaucracy. As we all know, the Commission hasn't got a single member who is democratically elected. As we have now seen during this crisis, it is the Commission who is getting most of the powers that are now given to EU. And that is really worrying from our view. Of course, we appreciate the peace project and the things we can achieve economically and environmentally and all that cooperation that EU was made for originally. But we have went too far. We have went too far and too fast.
It was always a project devised by elites, starting with Jean Monnet, but which, with the exception perhaps of Britain and a bit one or two Scandinavian countries, did have popular support.
Sir Stephen Wall was a chief advisor on Europe to successive British governments and a renowned British European.
Here you have a group of 27 countries who, without some mechanism to unite them, A, would be very quarrelsome on trade and economic issues. That's the negative side of it. On the positive side of it, we are all democracies. We do have some shared values. And I think that in terms of trade policy and aid policy and its political stance generally, the European Union is a power for good in the world. Now, that doesn't deal with your fundamental question of how then do you get popular buy-in for it, except that I suppose you could argue that now, as in the past, if it actually delivers in terms of economic prosperity, then people will be less worried about the democratic deficit.
It's a bit like China.
Yeah, it's a little bit. It's not, don't take that analogy too far, because it's not undemocratic. I mean, the decisions are being taken by ministers, all of whom are democratically elected. They are mandated by their parliaments.
Yes, but those democratically elected parliaments, how much power will they have in the Europe that emerges from this crisis? Almost certainly national budgets in the Eurozone will in the future have to be submitted to Brussels for approval. Won't national populations start to say, wait a minute, this government we've elected, is it accountable down the way to us or upwards to Brussels, to an institution we haven't elected? The Finns are already saying it.
In the beginning of the 90s, we had a huge depression. We were almost in a similar shape than Greeks or Portugal now. During that time, thank God, we still had our own currency. We devalued it and did a lot of savings. And in the end, we pulled through. Europe.
You're one of the richest countries in Europe.
Yes, at the moment, yes.
But do you accept that if you're in a single currency, you have certain responsibilities to the people you share, the nations you share that currency with?
Now, that is the big question. How could they sell this idea to the Finnish people in the first place and to the peoples of Europe in the first place, that we should join the euro? Part of the deal was that we do not have any sort of bailout policy. It was clearly said in the EU treaties. As we broke this fundamental rule, then we broke the original euro system.
The economic imperative is for more Europe, more fiscal discipline imposed by Brussels. There is a political backlash to this, a resistance by some of the nations, but not all.
Every time I come to Berlin, every time I see the Brandenburg Gate, I always remember the night in November in 1989 when I drove up here from Warsaw with an American journalist called Ann Applebaum. We actually arrived here in the east, then crossed Checkpoint Charlie to the other side.
Radoslav Sikorski was, in 1989, a young journalist working for a British newspaper. He's now Poland's foreign minister and one of the most interesting politicians on the continent. This is him speaking in Berlin in November. In the context of the history of these two countries, it's a remarkable speech.
I will probably be the first Polish foreign minister in history to say so, but here it is anyway. I fear German power less than I'm beginning to fear German inactivity.
Think of it, a Polish foreign minister in Berlin urging Germany to throw its weight around in Europe. It was as though he was saying, we've got over the Nazi nightmare, so should the rest of Europe.
I think it was a statement of Poland's new confidence. As you know, there is plenty of history between us and Germany, but we have carried out a successful transformation from dictatorship to democracy and from a command economy to a market economy that survived the recent crisis without a recession. So we now have the confidence to tell the Germans what their responsibility in the current situation is, and that as the biggest economy on the continent and the biggest beneficiary of the current arrangements, they have the biggest duty to do something about it.
Poland has emerged with a stronger and stronger voice almost every year now in Europe. It's becoming more influential, more important. The centre of gravity is moving to the east. How do you see Poland's role in Europe changing in the years that lie ahead?
Well, without moving our borders for once, we have moved from Eastern Europe 30 years ago to being Central Europe a decade ago to now becoming Northern Europe in terms of our financial policies, our business culture. But you should also remember that Poland has a historic memory of itself as a largish regional country. We like to think that we've had a bad patch for a couple of 100 years and that we are only now simply returning to what used to be.
What has Poland reached in the last 10, 15 years? Let's say a top status of the economy, of political stability. Poland is, let's say, in the heart of Europe.
Joachim Bitterlich was a senior foreign policy advisor to Chancellor Helmut Kohl and one of the architects of the single currency.
The European Union, since its inception, has been founded on the relationship between Germany and France. You can imagine in the future the German-Polish relationship becoming more important than the Franco-German relationship.
Perhaps yes, perhaps as important, because if you take the three, there you see the mirror of Europe, and at the same time the backbone. The French, in my eyes, underestimate the importance of Poland till today. The Germans, I think, Berlin has understood it. If you want, one of the advantages of being in Berlin is that relationship.
The single currency was designed to stop nations gaining an unfair advantage by devaluing. Germany has been the great beneficiary of what the Treaty of Rome called ever closer union. The true Finns are now flying a conspiracy kite that European federalists will use the current crisis as a way of binding the nations of Europe more tightly together. In fact, they're starting to say maybe that's been the plan all along.
Is it really possible that they did not see the problems of the Greeks? I've heard from a very reliable source the problems of the Greeks and even the tampering of the numbers was widely known in here, Euro Parliament, and it was just ignored because it didn't fit the image that the Euro system is perfect. Now when the crisis is here, the federalists are not willing to take one single step backwards. They are trying to advance the integration even further because of the crisis.
So they're using the crisis in order to push forward the federalist project.
Exactly. That makes me think, how far was the original Eurosystem an unintentional failure? Was it a deliberate plan to create the United States of Europe at any cost?
It is a seductive conspiracy theory with a powerful popular appeal among those already inclined to Euroscepticism. You hear this in Athens everywhere, that the euro crisis is a manufactured emergency to allow foreign capitalists to pillage the country's assets. It is a Greek revolt against the European ideal. Paradoxically, Ed Balls, now the finance spokesman for the British opposition, claims he was against the euro, in part at least because he believed it would, in the long run, damage, not strengthen the European project.
I was always, and have always been, a strong pro-European. My view was that the potential stress this would mean for the European project was big and risky, but my view for Britain was always that pro-Europeanism here was too fragile to deal with the potential stress and shock of our membership. So far from being a sceptic argument about Britain's relationship with Europe, my argument was always that the pro-European cause could potentially be set back for a generation if we got this wrong. That's why it had to be proceeded with great caution.
Europe's elites want more Europe, not less. They want Germany to act, to help impose its legendary discipline on the rest of the continent. Given its history, Germany is squeamish about imposing anything. Lord Kerr, the former British ambassador to the EU.
For them, it's really important to internationalise the controls. They don't want Germans to be seen as controllers. They genuinely don't want to control, in my view. I think it's not just perceptions, it's reality. But that drives them to wanting a bigger Brussels. And that is not popular in Paris and clearly very unpopular in Britain.
For this series for the BBC World Service, I've drawn this conclusion. The Eurozone countries now face a clear choice. Force some countries to drop out of the single currency and retreat to national silos. Or lock more tightly together and surrender more sovereignty, especially over tax and spending, to Brussels. The choice it makes will be made, in effect, in Berlin. The project began in the 1950s as a way of Europeanising Germany. Half a century on, the fate of the continent lies in the hands of a reluctant German Chancellor.
Europe's Choice was presented by Allan Little and produced by Jane Beresford.
There are dozens of different podcasts now available from the BBC, including news, documentaries, science, business, arts and sport. For details of them all, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.